We're live.
Ooh.
Really pleased to say hello to everyone. Stop it, Troy. Really pleased to say hello to everybody today, and welcome to the first of what I hope will be many videos on the Firepower Gaming channel. I'm really pleased to be chatting to somebody who spoken to numerous times on Twitter before. Just enough to get the opinion that he was actually a thoroughly nice bloke. So I'm really pleased that he's agreed to appear on this video. And obviously what's also important is that this is an international event. By the powers of the internet, we're contacting Troy, otherwise known as Sonic Sledgehammer, over in Germany. So
Unbelievable.
Troy, without getting too much into your gaming history, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, my name's Troy. I've been doing this for, well, like this. What is this? I've been painting and playing.
You tell me.
Yeah, I mean, if you're here watching this and you're not already got a little bit of a clue about what this is, I'm very surprised. But I've been at it for probably longer than I care to admit, 20 plus years at this stage. And, painting and playing with toy soldiers. And recently trying to sort of put that out into the world and share with people the techniques and tricks and stuff that I've learned in those many long years.
Well, you must have started when you were about 2 or 3 then, Troy, surely.
That's very kind of you. I'll not correct you, but no, it all kicked off. I was, geez, how old was I? I was 10 years old. And my grandfather, he unwisely purchased for my birthday some gift vouchers for our local game store. And I went in and I bought, it was a box of Cadian Imperial Guardsmen when they were still metal, and a 15mm, it was a Crusader. And I think that might have been one of Battlefront's very earliest miniatures, if it was Battlefront at the time. But I remember them very clearly.
So when you say you went into a local game shop, Troy, which local game shop and where in the world are you talking about?
That would have been, now I'm hoping I'm remembering the name properly because it changed. It was either Heroes for Sale or Mark 1. And the New Zealanders out there will recognise those names. I'm from Hamilton originally in New Zealand, and I spent a lot of my years in Palmerston North growing up, which is quite a bit south of there. And, it's small town by the reckoning of most folks online, unfortunately. But we were lucky enough that we've always had a pretty vibrant gaming community and, well supported by stockists and stuff, even right down on the bottom of the planet.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, I mean, it's quite interesting that you went straight into that whole kind of GW world without necessarily getting into things like Airfix Toy Soldiers. And I don't know, did you read things like comics, Warlord, Victor? I mean, I don't know what the comic scene was like down there in New Zealand when you were growing up. But I mean, yeah, what I found when I was a child was, I suppose, that we were probably, my grandfather was in the Second World War, and it was still really quite fresh in the public consciousness. Things like Warlord and Commando comics you could still buy in your local newsagents. I think sadly a lot of those things are lost now to this generation. So you were straight into the hardcore GW battlefield stuff right from the start.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned Airfix kits, because I ended up coming into the hobby in sort of the reverse of how you just mentioned. I picked up these Cadian figures, and being 10, they were cool. They were cool army men.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize at first that there was a game attached to them. But I think I was a couple of years older when I discovered, you might have come across the Revell box sets that were a vehicle in 1/72 scale, and they normally came with about 20, 30 guys.
Yeah.
And that was where I got my first sort of real step into the hobby as this part that had gaming attached to it. Because where I was, our local library had a copy of Donald Featherston's Wargames. And that little book has a lot to answer for. Armed with these tiny plastic figures and a rudimentary knowledge of how these things were supposed to interact with the words on the page,
Yeah.
I started getting into wargaming. And it was from there that the interest in history and what does all this mean started to take root in, preteen head.
Yeah. So when did you first pick up a paintbrush then, Troy?
Oh, it would have been with those Revell guys. I would have been about 12, 13 when I really started painting. And I made the grievous error of deciding to get started by picking up the little Humbrol paints. I don't know that, there are other people who've probably made that same error as small people. And I was dreadfully confused when I went to rinse my brush off in the water and this strange grey sludge is what happened. And that's how I had to convince my mum to let me have terps in my room.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tricky conversation for a teenager to have with his mum, I should imagine.
Yes, mother. I need flammable materials in my bedroom for legitimate purposes, I swear.
So we've already covered, or we've already touched on, some of the aspects of what you do. Not only are you a YouTube megastar, but you're also a superstar painter. You're an avid war gamer. Of those three things, how would you describe yourself? How would you describe your hobby? What sort of hobbyist are you?
I always kind of blanch when I get described as like a YouTuber or like my wife. She works in marketing, which she hates. I think most marketers are required to hate it. But she said, "Oh, you're becoming an influencer," and I.
Oh, definitely.
I don't. Because I don't see myself in that role. How would I describe myself? I'm some bloke. I'm the dude down at your local club or whatever who just happens to know a little bit of everything. Toot my own horn for a second there.
Yeah.
But I struggle to think of myself as this personality. The channel and all the painting videos has kind of happened almost by accident.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I'm just some dude,
But I mean, I suppose again, it's testament to the fact that it's never been easier to connect to people, has it? And although we all see ourselves as having this really niche interest, that actually, it's really quite possible to reach out to any number of different people all over the world. Yeah. So that kind of leads me on then to, further question then about how you actually got involved in YouTube in the first place, and what's the background to that, how I paint things serious.
Well, I got started, a friend of mine in the US, he picked up the, what was it? I want to say Call of Cthulhu, one of the board games. And of course, there are some really fantastic miniatures out there in board games these days. And he got in touch with me and he said, "Hey, how would I paint these things? I really want them to look cool. I don't want just bare plastic." And of course, it's simple enough to explain something, but especially with a visual medium like painting, the demonstration is often what makes a difference. So I started out just explaining to him, okay, well, you would do this, and then I put my phone in front of me and I recorded a little bit of how he could just prime some miniatures and put some paint on. Absolute basics. And he was dead pleased with that. And I thought, well, maybe, there's there's a niche for that.
Hmm.
Because I think on YouTube, especially, you do see, like, there are people out there doing fantastic guides in that. But sometimes it's a little further than I think some people have got the time for, as far as painting and styles are concerned. So what sort of the genesis of the channel and literally how I paint things was, taking old army painting techniques to get models in the cabinet at Games Workshop, um, and sharing them with people who just might not have had that resource. Maybe they can't access a club, or they don't have a White Dwarf subscription, or whatever it is. And like you said about being able to connect with so many people, I thought, well, maybe there is that audience out there. And lo and behold, people started asking questions, and
Yeah.
it snowballed ridiculously out of control from there.
Well, I mean, looking at your 38 million subscribers, I think you're currently running at the moment. You really oh, sorry, I'm looking at my notes. That's 38,000, but that's still not an inconsiderable number.
It's
So,
terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fantastic. I mean, did you envisage that there would be that level of interest?
Never. Like, honestly, never. What I've said, I didn't set out to essentially achieve anything with it. It was a part of the hobby which people reacted very positively to, and I wanted to then carry on. And okay, well, here's some other little things I know, and they just kept showing up and asking questions. And yeah, if you'd have told me when I got started that I would have 1,000 people watching, I would have laughed it off. It was a little project for my mates. So woo.
Yeah, I mean, I agree entirely with what you say about. I mean, I would describe my painting as workmanlike at best, and I think the best characteristic that I have is that I'm quite industrious and will just stick at it. But I do find some of the tutorials that are out there to just be really quite intimidating. They're fantastic, and they provide wonderful examples of what can be done. But I know that I will never be able to paint like that. And I think one of the things that I really enjoy about your channel is that how accessible it is. I think a lot of that has got to do with your demeanor and how you present it. I mean, I love the warts and all approach. I love it when things don't quite go right, but that just makes it all the more human. So, I mean, is that an approach that you've kind of nurtured, or is that just something that's a facet of your personality and it comes out when you're filming?
It's actually a really interesting way of sort of putting it, is that something that was deliberate. One of the best bits of advice I ever got was, don't worry about mistakes. A mistake is just you learning something. And I think one of the early videos that I did, it was a Skaven warlord that I was painting. And when I was painting his banner, I messed it up, and it didn't come out like I had planned at all. And there I am with this thing in front of me, and I'm recording, and I said, oh, nuts. That's not what I wanted to happen. Oh, what a shame. Let's fix it. And then instead of editing that out, left it in. And I think, that got a lot of very positive responses. People watching, coming back from a mistake as something that's not, you don't have to strip the miniature, you don't have to start over. It's okay to mess it up. Because anytime you're moving a brush with some paint on it, you're learning about all the different qualities that go into painting. And that was something which, from then on, quite deliberately, I have left in those, like I call them, those little oops moments, because they happen. And what you said about being human, we all are, And some of the work that you see out there online or on boxes, that is literally someone who's either putting their best work forward or they're paid to do this full time. So
Mm.
of course their work looks impeccable, and that is something to aspire to. The people who can dedicate themselves to learning a craft to that level, that's admirable.
Yeah.
But I don't have that kind of time. I just want to paint some toys. And yeah, accessible is what's always been the goal.
Yeah.
That anyone can do it. You are going to make mistakes, but don't worry about it. Just dry brush over the top of it. We'll add some Agrax Surshade. It'll be fine.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic, because I think you have absolutely achieved that in how you present the videos. I find them hugely encouraging, and I think I'm now using at least 3 of your techniques. I'm sure. I'm doing the occasional highlight. I'm still messing up my dry brushing, and I'm washing everything now, because it just seems to hide 1,000 errors. But there we go.
Oh yeah.
Well, look,
My stuff looks awful until the shade goes on.
it's when the magic happens. It's when the magic happens. Yeah. So then, is there anything you don't enjoy painting? I mean, I mean, I hate horses particularly, but is there anything you don't enjoy?
Oh, I'm going to get in trouble. All right, I'm gonna admit something. The bombshell reveal of this one. I don't like painting Space Marines. It's not that I don't like the miniatures. Space Marines are cool, and I love some of the models that are coming out. But I've just painted so many Space Marines over the years that there's not much to them that's really engaging anymore. And that's not a fault of the models, and I don't think that that's something because they're difficult or whatever. I'm just something that isn't powered armored,
Yeah. Well, I suppose they keep getting bigger as well, so it takes longer to paint each one.
Right. No, but on a slightly more serious note, robes and cloaks are something that I struggle with. After all this time, they're still a pain in the butt. So
yeah. Well, so I think you've talked about your channel. You obviously paint very broadly, but tell us a bit more about the sort of the wargaming side of the hobby. What aspects of that are you particularly interested in?
It's funny because almost until I started the channel, I would have described myself as being mostly into science fiction and fantasy stuff, whether that is Games Workshop or any other number of suppliers out there. I've always been a guns, tanks, and aliens kind of guy.
Mm-hmm.
But as more people started asking questions about, well, how would you paint, Napoleonic French, which is something I'd never tackled before, and someone kindly sent along a box, and I was like, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And as a result, my interests have just exploded. So, you yourself, you've been a terrible influence trying to get me into, Cold War gaming and stuff. And there are a couple of 10 mil packs coming from Pendragon at the moment. But yeah, just as I became, because I've always been interested in history, but the idea of gaming it and putting it on the table, for some strange reason, hadn't really connected in my head. But at the moment, having the opportunity and sort of the drive to approach so many different fields, I really enjoy the variety, and as a result, I start looking into my Wikipedia tabs just go out of control. So yeah, a little of everything is the short answer.
Well, and I very much remember your French Napoleonic video. I think that and the Redcoat video that you did really stood out for me, because I'd always found the idea of painting Napoleonics to be incredibly intimidating. I really, really didn't know where to start with them. And also as well, you know, I've only recently started painting 28mm miniatures, because I think to a large extent, I felt much more comfortable painting 6 and 15mm. And I think that was purely down to just not having the confidence in my painting to want to try these larger scales. So, you know, so thanks for that. You know, I really do appreciate that. And it's interesting as well, you know, talk about the influence, different periods. For me, I've always enjoyed the history first and foremost.
Mm.
And then the wargaming came along really as I was a teen, and it's always been supplementary to my enjoyment of history. If I've enjoyed the period from a historical perspective, being able to wargame it just adds a completely different dimension to it, I think. You know, it makes my enjoyment of the history much richer. And at the same time, I think it informs my gaming too. So for me, the two have always gone hand in hand, really. But that's not to poo-poo the sci-fi and the fantasy, because I think, you know, given that we're all talking about, you know, trying to attract new people into the hobby, I think the most important thing is just to play games, isn't it? Throw dice, and
Yeah.
it doesn't matter what minis you're pushing around; they're all counters at the end of the day. So I'll just go on to sort of my next question then now, Troy, if you don't mind. And I mean, and it's to do with, again, balancing these different aspects of the hobby. Yeah, how do you balance producing content for the channel against, you know, possibly your hobby interests that might lie elsewhere?
It is kind of tricky. And it is, I guess, the flip side of the opportunities that the channel has brought along to me, in that it does eat a lot of what would otherwise be personal hobby time. You know, particularly at the moment where, what am I trying to say here? We'll trim this bit.
I think these are the bloopers.
Oh yeah, they happen. We all make mistakes. We're human. But talking about trying to balance, it's the work-life balance, isn't it? You know, whether you're at work or what have you, the time that you have for yourself has always got 8 or 9 different drawers on it. And when a video goes up, that is pretty much my hobby time for that day. You know, 15 minutes of video will literally take about 3 to 4 hours to prepare, paint for, render, all of that sort of stuff that goes on behind the scenes. So on the one hand, it is this double-edged sword, because on the one hand, there's the ability to essentially just answer people's questions or do something totally different because it interests me. And ultimately, the channel is called How I Paint Things. So I'll do whatever stands out to me the most. But the flip side of that is still going to be that it takes a while to do. And whether I'm painting a Space Marine or, you know, Napoleonic Frenchman or whatever, that's time that's not me mashing out a unit in one of my own armies. So it is a balance, and I don't think I've got a perfect solution to it yet.
No, but I suppose, again, as long as you're enjoying all of these different aspects and they're not necessarily a burden, it doesn't really matter. Maybe these things just take a little bit longer than they would do otherwise.
I can paint plenty slow. Some of my projects, yeah, will not get into the pile of shame, I don't think.
Well, look, so we've talked about this kind of, you know, this broad sweep of the hobby that you touch on all of these different aspects. But is there a particular range of miniature or a type of game, you know, that you'd really like to see?
See, it's when you ask type of game, there is something I'd like to see make a comeback, This is touched on, I think, quite well in uh, Battle Games. No, the Wargaming Compendium. That's the proper title. And if you don't have it, go out and get it.
Henry
You
will
know,
be pleased with the plug, I'm sure.
it's a wonderful book, and Henry's his narrative tone is just beautiful. It's like sitting at the pub with a mate talking toy soldiers. So, anybody out there that hasn't got it, it's got my full-throated recommendation. But in there, he talks about having run a campaign which gets called imaginations. Fictional places that have never existed, but are clearly based on certain regions that we find interesting, as a way to play out, fictional conflicts or what if scenarios and stuff like that. And I don't see a lot of, I guess, younger, gamers really approaching that. I don't know if it's because it's more difficult to imagine, places in a world that you know well.
Mm-hmm.
But even if you go back to periods like the Holy Roman Empire, well, you just come up with a name and tiny scrap of land. You can cram something in there, paint some uniforms however you like.
Yeah.
I was thinking the same way that you see some truly fantastic work and imagination going into Space Marine chapters or Stormcast chambers.
Mm.
I think the ability would be there as well for folks who want to do something a little more realistic. They can make stuff up. That's okay. And it's not, I don't know if it's really a cop-out to say that I'd like to see people make stuff up. But it's kind of a personal aspect to the hobby that I think people might enjoy if they gave it a shot. So
yes. Well, I think you've also touched on another really interesting thing there, which is the relationship between role-playing games and tabletop war games. Because I mean, I was a role player first, so I've never played an imaginations game, but as a DM or a games master, I would spend hours world making, drawing out maps, designing cities, the narrative around it. And it was a fantastically enjoyable part of the hobby. And I think I see some parallels, particularly in some of the Lardy rule sets, around the development of characters and the very strong narrative driven campaigns.
Mhm.
But I also get the sense that there's a lot of potential crossover between role playing and wargaming that hasn't really quite happened yet. And it would be really interesting to see, I think, if those two aspects of the hobby in the very broader sense, if they could actually have more of an influence upon each other. I think that it would unlock an enormous amount of potential, possibly within wargaming. You got a view on that, Troy? What do you think?
Yeah, no, potential's an interesting word, I think. Particularly the idea of being able to make up your own campaigns. Like, even if people were to, use real nations, real conflicts, or what have you. Most World War II gamers will have come across Operation Sea Lion as one example of the world that wasn't. Coming up with your own sort of crux point in history where if things had turned out differently, what would my campaign look like then? There's a lot of room. There's a huge amount of room for what if, let alone making up your own stuff. And the role-playing angle, I think, is one that, especially when you mention the Lardis, it comes in so strongly because you develop these characters, and instead of just being the little plastic fella, he's your big man, he's your leader. That's General von Klump, and he's got shit to do,
Yeah.
So, I don't know. Potential really is an interesting word. I think that's a really good way of looking at it, and giving people a bit of a nudge, to to explore it would be cool.
Well, I mean, just that really simple concept of introducing the big man,
Mm.
all of a sudden the level of immersion just changes completely, doesn't it? You can't help but develop a relationship with that toy soldier. You don't want him to die. You want
Yeah.
him to go on and be a hero and win the battle. And it's just one of those really, really interesting features of the hobby, which can be so kind of mathematical and so kind of rivet countery, if that's even a word.
It is now.
No, and all of it suddenly it becomes really, really personalised, and it just enables you to make that connection with the tabletop to a much greater degree. Well, look, I've got to move on because I'm conscious of time. So, look, you're a well-travelled chap, I think it would be fair to say. Is the so and you obviously started hobbying at an early age, so presumably you've taken that with you. Now, how's your experience changed as you've moved around the globe?
I mean, I've always been very lucky that where I end up, there's usually a really cool group. Well, not a group, but community, I guess, is the broader word. Really moving to the difference between New Zealand and England when I was a kid was massive because wargaming hadn't really set its roots down as much as it has done at the moment. Like, because obviously coming from New Zealand, I spent about 12 years away, then came back, and just the difference was night and day. Wargaming had become a thing, and that was really cool to see. But I have been lucky to always be in good company, as it were. And I think it's not even so much something that I've taken with me. Like I've always been a hobbyist, and I trying to move my collection across the entire planet. That's a pain in the butt. If you ever want to give that a shot, move internationally. And but I have been lucky, and as a result, I've made friendships that have lasted years across continents, and I think that speaks more to the nature of the wargamer, as it were, or the role player, that generally we're a pretty decent bunch. I know some people like to pick on this stereotype of sort of the grimy mouth breather, rivet counter type, but in 25 years, they are the minority, and I'm glad to see that continues to be the case. Where I go, people are pretty cool.
Yeah, no, I mean that's fantastic, and one of the things I'd really like to do in subsequent videos as well is to try and make contact with gamers in more far-flung places to just see how much that experience differs from place to place. One of the things that, again, going back to the Little Wars TV video about the state of the hobby and was it dying, I wondered just how much that reflected an American perspective of the hobby, and how difficult it must be, I suppose, to live in a country that's so vast that it's not just possible to get in the car and drive for 40 minutes or 30 minutes to your local gaming group, or to just pop down the road to see your mate who also plays war games. It must be a very, very different experience.
Yeah,
Well,
I've got a mate. Hi, Jan. If you end up watching this, he lives in. Oh God, no, I want to say Tennessee, but he's going to give me a kicking if I've got that wrong. But he lives nowhere. He lives in the absolute dark center of the universe as far as gaming is concerned. So his experience is, well, if he wants to play, he's got to have two armies and either play by himself or wrestle one of his buddies on the off chance they happen to be in the region. Picking up an army and taking it to even a local club is a mission. And that's something which has never been part of my hobby experience. I've always been lucky enough to be close to people who play or a place to play. So the American perspective is one that I'd actually be really interested to hear more about from folks over there, because man, your country's big.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's see. Let's hope that somebody's going to watch this video. Fingers crossed. And maybe they might be based in North America, and we could possibly have a chat. Because there's some great stuff coming out of the States as well. I mean, obviously, Little Wars produce fantastic content. I mean, Travis has got the fantastic Tabletop CP channel as well, which is just absolutely wonderful. His battle reports, just absolutely fantastic. And if we can chat as simply and easily as this, then really there's no reason why I shouldn't try to do so, really. And that kind of really is a neat segue into my final question. I'm sure you'll be pleased to hear, Troy. And it follows on from the earlier comments really about the state of the hobby, which is such a current conversation. Little Wars TV video. But you're obviously, I think you could describe you as one of the innovators in the hobby, and by that I mean you really have got to grips with social media, YouTube in particular. So given that we have so many of these types of tools available to us, it's never been easier for us as gamers to connect. It's possible to create international communities. That to me is a real game changer in enabling us to raise awareness of the hobby and what we do. I mean, what's your view on that? And what's your view on how hobbyists, manufacturers are actually engaging with these new channels of communication? Are we making the best of what we've got?
I, for one, like you mentioned, we sort of touched on the internet. We live in an age where if you have what you think is a good idea, you can post it online and it happens or it doesn't. The age in which people can self-publish, and there are some fantastic rule sets out there which you can play with counters or miniatures that you just get from anywhere, which they will find a community around the world. I'd love, some of these things I'd really love to see gain traction locally, but using the internet as a means to just share ideas, I know I've mentioned that it might sound kind of cliche, but the information superhighway, it's there. Yeah. And the original question of, is the historical wargaming scene dying? No, next question. But I think it's fairer to say that it is changing, because the periods of history, which I figure, people are now further removed from World War II, for example, than when we got started gaming. What interests the next generation is what we as the old guard also need to be aware of, because what they want to play, we can help them with that. Or we might find something that they didn't realize they were interested in. Like me ending up painting Napoleonics and buying sharp practice and having boxes of Perry miniatures in my thing. You don't know the interest is there until somebody gives you the nudge. Yeah. And I think rather than the image of the old curmudgeon saying, oh, the pants colors must be this and so on, we can instead be there as the sounding board for the next generation who come along and go, oh, I happened to watch Band of Brothers, or I saw this movie Fury, or, any of the other things. You can start your kids watching Sharp.
I think there's also a risk in being too nostalgic about these things. I mean, I think you're right. I think that, as I mentioned, I could go on a Sunday morning and buy my copy of Battle, or I could buy my Commando comic. Time has moved on, and that immediacy, or that link that I felt with my grandfather in the Second World War for most children just doesn't exist anymore. And I think the risk is that we just try to recreate our experiences and expect the current generation to find them attractive. And I don't think that that's necessarily going to work. I think it's about finding new ways to reach people. And I also think as well, things like, for example, the Hero Clicks game, where you've got the miniatures, you've got a really, really basic, accessible set of rules to basically enable you to play a tabletop skirmish game. Well, why can't that be seen as a perfectly valid way of accessing the hobby? No, it's not pushing around 135 scale, 132 scale British paratroopers or 8th Army soldiers, but the principles are still the same. It's just that the miniatures have changed and the context is slightly different. I think the risk is that this generation of children are just not going to find the same things that we found necessarily as attractive.
I think the possibility too is that they might find it interesting later. We are 200 years removed from the Napoleonic Wars. We still play those games. We still play medieval period games and, with Romans and stuff like that. That interest is always going to be there. I just don't necessarily think it will always be as immediate. But I think science fiction, comic book, fantasy games as a way of introducing somebody to that lifelong addiction, it's perfectly valid. You are playing with toy soldiers, man. Just enjoy it, whatever floats your boat.
And I mean, maybe, and if Games Workshop is the great entry point for so many people into the hobby, maybe we should possibly stop being quite so curmudgeonly about their place in the market and actually acknowledge that they're a really, really vital part of introducing youngsters to gaming. And if historical gaming or historical wargaming is the end result of a process where people find their entry level games through the likes of Warhammer 40k or Age of Sigmar or whatever it happens to be, and then a small percentage of those people actually go on to become historical gamers, well, maybe we should be saying, well, actually, the potential for the hobby, given that Games Workshop is so large and is doing so well, is possibly quite rosy in the long term. It may well be that we're just experiencing a bit of a lull as people move through that funnel and before they become historical gamers.
I think, or rather, I don't think there's anything necessarily sinister in historical gamers or, whatever science fiction or fantasy games you want to play, of looking at Games Workshop games as their own recruitment tool. Like, if someone wants to spend their entire hobby life in Games Workshop games, that's all well and good. But it doesn't mean we can't be there for them with other stuff that they might find cool.
Yeah.
That's my lovely wife.
Well, Troy.
Hello, lovely wife.
Well, in that case then, Troy, that sounds like a fantastic time to bring things to a halt. Thank you very much for your time this evening. Really, really appreciated it.
No, it was a pleasure.
And, and it would be great to keep in touch. It would be really lovely. And I will be watching the latest installment of How I Paint Things, I'm sure, as soon as it comes out. So I look forward to seeing it, Troy.
Yeah, whenever that happens.
You take care, mate. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you kindly.